Okay, here we are. And Holbrook Mahn, very, very nice to see you. And thank you for spending some time with me.
Well, thank you for having me, Anthony.
What a pleasure on my end.
Well, I would debate that because I really appreciate what you've been doing with helping to get out different perspectives on Vygotsky's work, and I especially appreciate it because you're coming at it from a very practical practitioner perspective, and that's always been something that is in my heart, but doesn't always get to my mind when I'm writing articles. It's Vera John Steiner once said, it's way too theoretical. You've got to give examples, and so what you're doing is a perfect antidote for my tendency to get off into the abstract realm. So,
okay, so I'll keep that in mind as we move forward tonight. Because,
okay,
that sounds like just kind of like what I'm after, to be quite honest. But before we get like deep into some of the practical applications or just some of the practical and potential teaching aspects of Vygotsky's work, I have a question that sometimes I like to ask, and I'm wondering, like, how would you describe your role or maybe your relationship to like the wider like Vygotsky-sphere, so to speak?
well, it's interesting that you pose that question because something that I thought about almost from the first time I was really introduced to Vygotsky in the early 1990s when I was doing my master's. And then I had the good fortune when I came to UNM to work very closely with Vera John Steiner. But before coming to UNM for my doctoral studies and then for my career, I taught there for about 25 years at University of New Mexico. I spent 20 plus years as a political activist with the Socialist Workers' Party, and so I've had quite a solid background in Marxism and also in a Marxist critique of the Soviet Union, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. And that's a perspective that Vygotsky had too. He, in his crisis article, talked about the crisis with Marxist psychology, which was really the psychology that was sanctioned at that particular moment by the Soviet bureaucracy headed by Stalin. And so coming to Vygotsky with that kind of foundation and the understanding of the Stalinization of the Russian Revolution, I think it was a relatively unique perspective because understanding what happened, the political, economic, social context in which Vygotsky was writing is really very, very important. Lenin died in January 1924, and Vygotsky came to Moscow in January 1924. And so those two events were very, very significant because Stalin pretty much turned the revolution and in the process, Marxism on its head. And then, Leontiev broke with Vygotsky on the central core of Vygotsky's work and substituted something that was more aligned with the Soviet bureaucracy. And so the distortion of Vygotsky's work by Leontiev has been very, very significant. And so that's the foundation for activity theory and chat. And I do not relate to either one of those. Early on in my study of Vygotsky, I came to realize how poor an understanding that the interpreters were had of Marxist methodology and the way that Vygotsky was using that. And so I pretty much spent my time reading Vygotsky and trying as much as possible with the help of Russian students to get into the original Vygotsky writings. And so it's a long-winded way to say that I might be my own little moon on which, Vera and Jim Lantoff and Auro Tamela reside. And so that's sort of how I fit in.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. And we did talk a little bit about that when we first met briefly last week. But I'm very naive on these topics. But I would like to ask you, like, since you have that particular background, what would you say maybe was an advantage of coming from that position, or maybe even a disadvantage if you want? Take it either way.
Well, the advantage is, I think that, well, first of all, it's tremendously advantageous to dig into Vygotsky's work, which is difficult to do because it's been so poorly translated and manipulated and censored. There's an Argentinian who translated from the original Russian into 1934 into the Spanish volume, Pensamiento y Habla, and he noted that from the final revision censoring that Leontiev did in a Russian edition in 1982, upon which the 1987 Thinking in Speech is based, there were over 1,000 differences. Some of them were, small, stylistic, but a large number were theoretical and philosophical. And so it's difficult to wade through, and that's why I think it's people rely a lot more on interpretations of Vygotsky's work and not his work as not in the original, but his actual works. So I think that gives me a tremendous advantage. And if you don't understand the method that he's using, everything else is built on a foundation of sand.
Yeah, one of the first things that I was coached with when I started this like recent video project, and wasn't even intended to be a project, it just sort of developed into one. But one of the first things I was coached with was like the importance of dialectics and using that sort of method, and like differences between like development versus learning and understanding, and just terms like that. That was sort of like the seeds that were dropped on the ground for me to follow, sort of. And eventually I realized that taking that approach, I guess, was one way to see this method in a way that it's not normally talked about. So I guess in brief, like just like the importance of dialectics and the way that he approached it, I guess.
Well, and I think that's a central point, Anthony. And the issue is, what do you mean by dialectics?
Yeah.
And that gets to be, that's one of those terms that everybody's heard and they use in many different kinds of meaning, with many different kinds of meanings. And it's very, easy for some people to get lost in Hegelian dialectics, but the key piece of it is really the logic and understanding dialectical logic as opposed to, or in addition to, formal logic, because in that difference is the difference between analyzing a product, a manifestation of something, a phenomenon, versus the process. And if you're just using formal logic, you're stuck with empirical studies in looking at observable, measurable phenomenon. But that leaves out process. Everything, the universe and everything in it is in a process. And it's only by using dialectical logic that you can gain the kind of understanding about process that Vygotsky mentioned. And you mentioned learning and development. There's a lot of misunderstanding of that, but Vygotsky talks about the unity of learning and development, but not the identity. So it's really different, but the same. And it's that unification that can only really be understood using dialectical logic. I don't know if you've ever run across a book by George Novak called An Introduction to the Logic of Marxism.
No, I've heard you reference it in one or two of your video lectures. But
well, to show my appreciation for you undertaking this very large project, I'd like to send you a copy. So if you send me your address, I'll send you a copy.
I'll put it on my bookshelf next to many books where it will look like very out of place, but I like that. I like having an eclectic.
Well, I'm going to do this only on the condition you put it at the top, not the bottom. Stack.
My David Lynch books are always going to be at the top, so I have to start.
Okay. All right, good.
First things first, you know what I'm saying? So it is hard for me because like I'm a full-time teacher, and that's where I have to spend the majority of my time. And it's very hard for me to discipline myself with this kind of little project I'm doing, because one of my first goals was to one of my initial questions was like, can somebody understand this stuff without a decade? You know what I'm saying? Like, can you understand this in a year or two? And I have some background as well, but can somebody understand this like usefully enough without having to go deep and down? And so I'm always trying to like move one step forward, two steps back. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, well, I was going to add that I've been at it for nearly 3 decades, and
yeah,
I'm just beginning to understand it.
And that's standard. You know, that's the standard answer, and everybody feels that way. But
but it shows the profundity and depth of his thought.
Yeah. So I want to just shift just a tad to like, I guess maybe my main goal for today, my main topic, and that would be I guess the idea or the concept of like system of concepts. And if you just give me a minute, I'm going to just read it a little bit just to keep myself organized. So it's been catching my attention for a little while now in 4 different ways. So first, there's something we probably won't talk about today, which is Vygotsky's theory itself as like a system of concepts, and how it consists of many concepts either that existed or that he created or developed that all relate to each other and that relate to the main subject matter, which as far as I understand is the process of the development of higher mental functions. How all the concepts and the laws and the methods sort of relate to each other. So in short, that's number one, system of concepts as like a theory with interrelated parts. And then, forgive me for going on a bit.
No worries.
His theory on how concepts are systemic, or how a concept itself is a part of a system of concepts. And then I've also been thinking about, is there like a best approach to teaching or helping others develop conceptual thinking in a systems way? Then lastly, I was interested in, this is based on checking out your work and enjoying it, and sometimes being intimidated by it, but mostly enjoying it. Like just any advice or experience you have with the notion of teaching in a sort of conceptual or a systems way.
All right.
So does that sound okay? Like that sort of agenda?
Well, considering we have 4 hours, I think that's wonderful.
Okay. Well, mainly the latter stuff is mainly what I'm interested in, more like the, I guess the pragmatic stuff, but maybe to get.
Well, I think that again is admirable, but one of the problems is if people go too quickly to the practical without really understanding the foundation, then it tends to be rather superficial.
Yes.
So, what is your concept of a concept?
Oh, okay. I guess it's a concept I would think is something that relates to a system. So it's related to other concepts. It's something that can be represented by a word whose meaning develops both culturally and, I guess, internally within the user of the word. Something that came into existence at some point in human culture and then kind of moved and probably adjusted as it was useful or not useful. I think it's probably something that was a solution to some kind of problem, which is why it arose, even if it didn't arise neatly. I guess stuff along those lines.
All right. Well, and you've done something that most people do, and it's something that Vygotsky keeps harping on, and that is that we don't start with a verbal definition, and I led you into that. But if any time you're looking, or students, or we are looking at a phenomenon, a concept, it's always important to look at its origins, and that's really what dialectical logic is that it's, because it's a process, you've got to look at its origins, what forces brought it into existence, what forces maintain its existence, where there are times of qualitative transformation within that process, and then what forces take it out of existence. And so if we're looking to the origins of concepts, we can do so by looking at it the way Vygotsky does, and that is phylogenetically with the species. How did concepts come into existence? And then also ontogenetically, how do concepts arise in the individual child? And one of the big problems that I'm recognizing more and more is that we tend to stop when we get to the origins. We stop with human beings. And if we're really going to understand it, we need to go back into the animal kingdom. So the animals have concepts. And when we're talking about animals, we can't use the definitions and the concepts that we're using to describe human beings, which is a big, big tendency, especially in consciousness studies. Instead, we have to look at it for that particular animal. That's what Thomas Nagel back in 74 famously entitled a paper, "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" And so that's getting to the actual experience of an organism and not applying human terms to it. So if we look at the origins of a concept for humanity, it's built on that conceptual structure that animals have and humans had before they took that dialectical leap that Vygotsky talks about to human consciousness. And so and that's where he talks about potential concepts, that humans have inherited from evolution up to the time of this dialectical leap, that which went before. And so if we look at the first concepts, how did concepts come into existence for early humans? So I can pose that question so I can get a drink.
This would be pre-language, right? This would be.
Well, I would put it right at that cusp.
This was some sort of maybe the need for some sort of shared reference or shortcut.
Okay,
Like
and
the start of abstraction, possibly.
Well, and that's very true, and that's what Marx talked about with and Engels. And I always try to say Marx and Engels because the two of them were very much a collaboration, co-thinking, and partnership. And Marx looks at tool use as bringing about this qualitative transformation, because in making it, it's not just tool use, it's tool creation, because other animals will use tools, but they don't create them, other than a chimp maybe taking some branches off for a twig to go into a termite mound or something like that. But humans, when they create it, they're building in this intent, and they're building in this a level of abstraction that's fundamental for human language. And I use language only to refer to human communication. All organisms, all life communicates. And in that communication, it's the development and creation of the individual and the social. Those two are dialectically united from the beginning. And so anytime it gets to be too much just an analysis of the individual separate from the social, you're missing the essence. And that's another big piece of Vygotsky's work, is when there's a unity, the brain-mind, instead of separating it for analysis, he says we have to maintain the whole. And for him, the kernel is meaning. And if we look at how meaning comes into existence, before that, it's sense. All organisms have sense apparatus to take information and process it and act on it. But that meaning comes, and if we go back to very early humans with rocks, let us say, creating a sharp edge, banging rocks together, that sound, that's whether it's a grunt or the sound of the actual objects, that sound becomes incorporated into the whole affective experience of that tool creation. Then that sound over time, and this is a process, when we say over time, could take thousands of years, but that sound, let's just say rock, that sound then has meaning for another. And that meaning then is the key. And the sound gets abstracted from the affective experience and is used to regulate activity. So if a rock is not present, then early humans have the sound, the concept of, and they can go look for a rock, and then they can plan in the future, which is something that chimpanzees or bonobos cannot do. They will, if there's a stick and bananas, they'll knock down the bananas with the stick, but if there's no stick in their visual field, then they won't go look for one. Well, in that moment, in that extended moment of creation of meaning, it's also a creation of a concept, because that word rock contains the meaning, and that meaning is this physical object, but it's also a tool, becomes a tool. And a fundamental jumping point, and this is crucial for the way that children develop concepts, is generalization, because that rock sound is not only one rock, it's rocks in general. And that abstract thinking process of generalization is key to human language. So right there, you have meaning, word or words, generalization, and then concept. And then it becomes a question of further generalizing that concept. So rock can then become weapon, can become tool, can become, partake in artistic endeavors. And so then it's this process of building up this, what I term a conceptual neuronal network. And that then becomes socialized, and it becomes conceptual understanding for humanity at large. And that process starts with this small little human groupings and grows up and develops to the point that you and I can share our concepts of concepts speaking into a piece of metal.
So one of the things, so one of the things that was jumping out to me that just was not at all obvious is the sounds, maybe the feelings, the senses, the sensations that go with that, maybe pre-language sort of, but like that activity, I guess, is very much part of the word that eventually will develop. It's not like an intellectual only type thing. The creation of the language, I guess, it's like really rooted in the experience. Does that sound?
Sounds right on. And I would just add affect.
Yeah.
And to take it over to the individual child, a word, and when you mentioned the word, and we tend to get focused on the word, and this is a huge problem with the way that Vygotsky's concept is znaczenie slova, which is the meaning, and slova is used as a synecdoche representing language, not just a particular word. And so it's meaning through these languaging processes, because Vygotsky says that when it becomes internalized, the meaning sheds the word. And so it's the meaning that's constructing this internal system, this internal conceptual neuronal network. It's not the word, it's the meaning. But because of the way it's been translated into English as word meaning, the focus is on the external word and not on the internal system. So to take this for an individual child with a word doggy. So that affective experience, and it's really important. The notion of affect is lost, I think, a lot, especially in teaching, that we're teaching the content and not the students, and the students' learning processes are very much affected by affect. So that child then,
Just
in
real
that,
quick, just
I'm
real
sorry?
quick. Very sorry to interrupt you, but I know affect is a word that almost everybody understands the word affect. But in this context, how could you define it, like in a simple way? Affect.
Affect is the experience that all organisms, thank you for interrupting too.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to. I was trying to find a moment.
No, that's fine. I think that's perfect. And I love it when people interrupt, as long as they have put down the breadcrumbs to help me get back to where we were before.
Yep. I got you covered.
So let's just go back to the one-celled bacteria. The very, beginning of life. That one cell is receiving information from its environment in patterns of energy, thermal, chemical, electrical energy. And that cell has to, in order to survive, has to decide, is this positive for survival or negative for survival? Does this feel good or does this feel bad? And that's affect. This experience that we're going through, does it have a positive or negative connotation? And that then determines what activity. And once you get up into human consciousness and conscious awareness, that's where you get into human emotions. Animals do not have emotions. In spite of what everybody says about their dog wagging their tail, they're happy.
Yeah, that's going to be your most controversial statement of the evening.
Well, the thing is that emotions are human constructions applied to humans. And that fundamental point, if we take those concepts that are developed for humans, by humans, about humans, and try to apply them to the dog, we are making a huge logical leap. It's fallacious. So I agree, dogs have, all life has affective states. But when that dog is wagging its tail, that's a dog's affective state. And no matter how many labels we put on it, it doesn't negate the fact that it's a dog's affective state. So let's get back to the puppy. Speaking of dogs and affect.
That's right.
So that little, does that help clarify?
Yes, I appreciate that. Yep.
Well, thank
and as you talk about I guess the development of the concept dog, or even the word dog, if you can at some point try to maybe define in your own way conceptual neuronal network at some point, that would be very helpful if you want.
Well, we might as well do that right now. Is that, when we talked about those first words, the first words are perceived and taken in and processed by the neurons, by the neuronal network that exists. There's 84 billion neurons in the human brain. And each one of those has dendrites, and it could be 1,000 or 10,000 connections. There are more connections inside the human brain than there are stars in our known universe. And so it's unbelievably complex. Well, that information comes in and it gets processed. And in that processing, if it's good for survival or successful, then those synapses and the neurotransmitters are strengthened so that an action potential will go down that path into this network. Well, this network for humans, well, animals have these concepts too, but for human language, then what we're doing is building these concepts. And those concepts then become part of this neuronal network. And this is, I think, a fundamental point on how the brain mind functions. Memory is not just stored in a certain location, because the brain, all brains are anticipating, so that when sound waves or light waves come in, rather than have them be fully processed, which takes more time, which could mean life or death in the jungle or in the wild, there's this anticipatory priming that takes care of some of the processing. And so with memory then, it's not going back and retrieving, it's creating. And so this network of concepts that we develop and that are part of the human conceptual understanding, these concepts are created, recreated, information comes in, and that's where they go. It's part of this conceptual neuronal network. So it's looking both at how the mind is processing it and primed to processing it, and how that information is coming in and sensed and transduced into the perceptual apparatus. So now let's get back to that little girl with her puppy and into your classroom. So,
Yes.
well, so that doggy, that little sound doggy, then is part of the smell, the sound, the taste, the licking, all of that. It's part of that affective experience. And then over time, that sound takes on a meaning, and then that meaning is internalized. And in that internalization, that's where it loses its connection with the actual word. And Vygotsky then talks about this whole system that's built based on meaning. And he talks about meaning as the internal system of the sign operation. And so he's taught this internal system is very similar to what I'm talking about with the conceptual neuronal network. And then that child generalizes it. It's not just my doggy, all doggies, and those are kitties, and as that generalization takes place, they're building their own concepts of how the world works and how their position in the world. And they bring all of those concepts, that system, to the classroom, where they're introduced to academic concepts from humanity. And it's that interrelationship between the conceptual understanding that a child brings to school and its relationship to the concepts that are being presented in the classroom. And to be effective teaching, you need to understand where your students are in their conceptual understanding and how that fits into the academic concepts that you're teaching. And in thinking about that, it's also very important to look at what Vygotsky talks about with crisis, where periods, and the word period has a lot of different connotations for psychology, but he talks about age 1, children getting up, walking around, so their concept of the world change. Then when they start gaining language and developing a concept of self change, and then when they go to school, another way, and then in adolescence, where they begin thinking in concepts. And so it's important for teachers to understand where, in this general process of development, their students are, and then where those students are in relationship to the concept that they're trying to teach. The students will bring their system of concepts, the teacher will have the system of concepts, and it's bringing those together that is key to effective teaching. And the big problem is that the teachers are over here with academic concepts, they understand them, and they think if they just put it forward, that students will understand it. Students are fitting those concepts into their own network or not fitting them in, which is often the case. And therein lies the difference between conceptual knowledge and conceptual understanding. If the students are just taking in the concepts that are being presented, they can go through all their schooling, get straight A's, but not have conceptual understanding, because conceptual understanding means that the teacher has effectively, with the student, in what Vygotsky calls obuchenia, the teaching learning processes, have had those students not get rid of these concepts, but to build on them. And he talks about, there's this German word aufheben, which talks about this process of remaining the same, but changing. And so these everyday concepts remain as a foundation, but the academic concepts are sort of growing down into the ground of the everyday concepts, and in the process transforming them. And that's where conceptual understanding takes place. You can have not knowledge without understanding, but you can't have understanding without knowledge. So the big challenge then is, how does a teacher understand for their particular grade level where their students are at conceptually? So how do you do that, Anthony?
Before I answer that question, I do want to there's a lot of different ways. But before I answer that, I'd like you to clarify a couple things, please. Let me just lay them out. So one is in a very simple way. What does it mean? What does thinking in concepts mean? Okay, so that's my first question. And then
let's since you may have a list there, let's.
No, it's only two. It's only two.
All right. Okay.
And I just don't want to forget my second one, which was.
All right, that's fine.
Is it really important or helpful, in your opinion, to make visible the conceptual system, use your phrase, I think, that a student has and that a teacher might have, as far as the system in which an academic concept fits? Is it helpful to make these visual so that when they sort of merge, it's easier? And is there like a way to, if this is growing down into the soil, is like the tilling of the soil like really essential, so to speak? That would be my second question. And the first one was like, how would you
thinking in concepts? Yeah.
Concepts?
Well, let's take the second one first. It is very helpful, I think, and I believe you've looked at some of the videos of mine where I try to graphically represent these abstract concepts. I'm not sure whether it's very successful or not, but I at least try. And that,
yeah, I mean, you have the most interesting PowerPoint slides that I've seen maybe ever, if not in a long time. And those are just very conceptual in and of themselves. But sorry to interrupt.
No, that when you're giving me a compliment, yeah, you could interrupt all the time you want. Thank you very much for that. That makes me feel good.
Yeah, they're very thoughtful. It's clear. Well,
I should probably take the next step and make them available. And you can help me with that. I've got them all. I have them recorded, but I've just got to get them up to YouTube in an organized way. So that visualization is very important. But one way to think about visualization is it's graphic. So what I do when I'm starting off with a unit, what I do is myself think about the concept that I'm trying to convey in that unit, and then to think about the subordinate concepts upon which that concept is raised, and the superordinate where that concept is leading. And that's that system of concepts. And so it's important to look at where they're the subordinate concepts. And if students don't understand the subordinate concepts, they're not going to understand the concept that the teacher's trying to convey. So that's where you start with the subordinate concepts and find out where students are at with those concepts. And I developed this technique. I call it a protocol because it's a whole system of techniques. And it's for a grant that I did with the U.S. Department of Education on it was called Academic Literacy for All. And it was aimed towards helping teachers in middle school and high school understand a way, whatever their subject matter, how to effectively do this process of helping students gain a conceptual understanding of the concept that is part of that unit. And in this protocol, we start off with having students write a couple of sentences. And that right there is visualization. It's that process of writing down and thinking and having to represent graphically their thoughts helps them. So they write a couple of sentences on the concept, and then in a group of 4, they discuss and create 2 new sentences with their elbow partner. And then after that, they, in the group of 4, come up with two sentences. And there's other things I do with it. But then if they read those out loud, just those 2 sentences from each group, then I know as a teacher, I've got a little bit of a feel for where the class as a whole, individually and socially, collectively, stands in relationship to this concept. And then I can tailor my teaching to help go from that foundation and build. And of course, every single student is going to have their own conceptual understanding network. And so for a teacher, I taught high school with classes of 30, 35 students. And so I use dialogue journals, which is another whole topic, to help me understand them, not just conceptually, but as human beings. There's Mike Rose has a book, which I think is sort of essential for educators, and it's Lives on the Boundary. And he underscores the importance of making a human connection. And that's what I try to do, is to make this human connection with every single student. And it takes time, but it pays off. And it engages them in a lot deeper way. So having that foundation, then as we go along, building activities which will allow each student to perform from where they're coming from, all leading to this goal, which is understanding the concept. And one of the big differences with the understanding is the ability to apply it in different circumstances in which it was learned, or to a different field, subject area. For example, you're an English teacher, right? And so the concept of genre.
Yeah.
So if I'm teaching the concept of genre for a prompt, what I would do is to have the students write 2 sentences on how is music organized? How is music organized? And in doing it that way, I don't say, how do I organize, or how do you, because then there are 2 sentences. It's about I, and then when you're sharing it and creating with a partner, you miss the we. And so how is music organized? All students have some concept of that, and that's the key to the prompt for those 2, is can every student write about it? So then they write about their music, and you get into classifications. And how do you determine which is hip hop, and all of the different. And then they get that concept of classification and grouping and categories. And those concepts, then they can apply in biology or chemistry, and just as another example, we talked about this previously, just when we were, informally chatting. And, if you're going to start a unit on Romeo and Juliet, the prompt that the teachers I was working with came up with, what makes a good movie? And then, you start getting into comedy and romance and tragedy and adventure. And so you start getting them thinking about those concepts. And then when they have those concepts, they can then begin to, you as a teacher, then tie them to their own lives and Romeo and Juliet. So it then means that you're building the foundation for them to access the concepts that are in a language which will be very difficult for them to penetrate. So those are things that then get into the concept of systems of concept. And then when you asked about adolescence, a good way to think, what's the way Vygotsky thinks about it, so is the difference between mathematics and algebra. With mathematics, you're looking at the relationship between an object and a symbol, 5. And with algebra, you're looking at the relationship between two symbols, two abstract symbols. And it's the ability to hold one concept in mind and be able to manipulate it and use it with a second concept. And that's the essence of thinking in concepts. And Vygotsky points out that this is not something that just follows in the regular developmental path. And I think this, one of your things you mentioned early on was relationship between development and learning. The concepts with algebra are not going to come just by development. You need the learning in there, and this is where it's so important for teachers to understand what it means to think in concepts and the transitions that their students are going through. Because if it's just performance up on the board with equations, they can do the equations, they have knowledge of them, but they don't have the concept. And to get that concept, the teacher has to understand this leap that they're going through and meet them where they are and help them to think in concepts. And that's where learning guides development. And so it was in a local school district here a few years ago, something like 69% of all students failed Algebra 1. It wasn't because the students didn't get it, it's because the teachers couldn't teach it because they didn't understand where their students were conceptually, and they didn't understand the subordinate concepts that are needed to access the concept in algebra and the subordinate concepts. So does that?
Yeah, that's very, very, very helpful. I enjoyed math quite a bit, and I was pretty good at it when I was in middle school and high school, but it's been a while. Is algebra a topic that you're comfortable ripping on for a little bit, just to be, many teachers are not thinking in these terms, or at least using this language, where we have things that we're trying to accomplish in our lessons, and we're not always thinking of even just thinking in concepts and consciously helping students to make such leaps, and thinking about we think about groundwork, like setting the groundwork and trying to help them walk up the steps, so to speak. But we're not always saying, here's the topic or the subject matter of the day or even of the unit. what is the conceptual system within which this topic fits. So I guess if you don't want to riff on algebra, is there like
you could it's interesting that you raised this, because when I was very young, I did well in mathematics, and then when it came to do algebra, my initiative to learn was replaced by my initiative to show off, be the class clown, misbehave, rebel. And so I wasn't as studious as you were. And so but I do remember, it's just, I can recreate it, that sitting in a particular chair in a particular room with algebra 1, and experiencing this different way of thinking. And that's where the joy of mathematics resides, is that discovery. And that's what's so absent from, especially as you go up, is the joy of mathematics. And so I was, at that point, I wasn't thinking about Vygotsky, but it really was thinking in concepts. And then I experienced the same thing when I started calculus, that this is a whole new way of thinking, and it was exciting, but it entailed a lot of some work, and I wasn't too much into work in those days. So yeah. I am not very conversant in algebra, but was there a particular point that you were hoping to make? Or
yeah, you say something like the ability to transfer your understanding in different contexts is a demonstration of thinking in concepts, whether it's procedurally, performatively, or even abstractly. Like, you could learn something and then use it elsewhere in a semi or even unrelated way. Would that be an illustration of thinking in concepts?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Okay.
It goes back to using dialectical logic. That the irony is that we just in our everyday life use dialectical thinking, because dialectics didn't come out of Heraclitus's or Hegel's or Marx's head. Dialectics came out of the universe. When the universe came into existence, dialectics came into existence, because there's that qualitative transformation. It's constant change, which is a part of dialectical logic. There's nothing constant but change. And then qualitative transformations. There's a qualitative transformation that brings the universe into being, and there's the forces that are at play with before and then after the Big Bang and the introduction of gravity and space-time. Those hold for all of the universe, and that process is a dialectical process. And so that's, Engels has a book, The Dialectics of Nature, where you look at the phenomenon to understand it. And this is a key point that Vygotsky reiterates over. And that is that with verbal definition, if you start with verbal definition, you're missing out on the being or the essence of whatever it is you're looking at. Instead of that, you go and look at the phenomena, try to understand it, see if you can find out what brings it into existence, its process, the materials, all of that. And from that, develop the definition as opposed to the other way around. I mean, there's some 40 definitions of consciousness. So, you know, it's a fundamentally different approach, and that, you know, it divides, you know, approaches that focus solely on the epistemological, the knowledge, the beliefs based on empirical studies, and studies that look at the being of something, its existence, which is an ontological approach. And Vygotsky said, you know, based again on Marx, his theory, that you've got to have both. You've got the empirical, epistemological, and the ontological, and those two together are the key if you're really going to look at the essence of what you're studying.
So I have something that you can help me with maybe in the very near future in my classroom, by way of example. So you talked about introducing the concept of photosynthesis through an accessible opening question, and having students go through the ALA protocol, which starts with being able to write 2 sentences, pretty much drawing upon your everyday concepts, right? So
Yeah.
how do you come up with an opening prompt? And I know you alluded to this briefly, but is there any way to maybe just break down your thought process?
So as opposed to me telling you what that prompt was, you already know it, but let's do a little co-thinking about how do you come up with a prompt? And so I'm asked, you start with what are the subordinate concepts behind the concept? So what are the subordinate concepts for photosynthesis?
I don't know. The fact that life draws upon other elements of life, like some sort of like plants draw upon the light to nourish themselves.
Okay. So we're dealing with light, and it's light, but it's energy.
Okay.
And then what happens to that energy?
It gets utilized and maybe transformed in some way.
It's got to be with this concept of transduction is one that's extremely important, and one that is rarely talked about. So a plant will sense the light waves. Then the light waves don't go right in any more than the light waves go into our brain. They're transduced. They're transduced into the kind of energy that the organism is using to survive. So that there's this process of energy coming in, it's sensed, and then it's transduced. And that transduction is where the unity for humans, where the unity of the brain-mind exists, because it's that transduction is taking from the sensation and then changing it into however the perceptive apparatus of that organism functions. So the light energy comes into, it's sensed by the plant, transduced into chemical energy. And that chemical energy, that process of transducing the light energy into chemical energy is that photosynthesis. So then you're dealing with the concepts of transduction, of light energy, of chemical energy, and those processes hold for all life. And so then,
so those are not just plant related.
no, it's
processes. Yeah.
everything.
That, so would that make them superordinate, or would that make them subordinate?
Well, what do you think?
Super.
Well, those are the concepts that students have to have. Light energy, transduction, and chemical energy are the concepts that they need to access photosynthesis. And then if you look up at this, the concept superordinates, you know, and you get into the chlorophyll, the whole way that the plant grows, survives. There's a wonderful documentary called Aware, in which this woman, Monica Galliano from Australia, talks about plants and plant life and how they sense and perceive and act on their world and how they communicate. So the superordinate ones are what the photosynthesis leads into. So then based on that, we're talking about something that's fundamental for all life, right? So then that's a question that all students could answer would be, how can you tell if something's alive?
I see.
And
it's engaging, yeah. Yep.
But they're not going to write about photosynthesis.
Right.
Or
transduction, yeah.
Yeah, right. Very good point. The tendency of teachers is to ask for verbal definitions. So if we're going to start a unit on photosynthesis, what is photosynthesis?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the end. The beginning is getting that concept. And so then they write a couple of sentences. Every student can, you know, have some idea about that. And then you know, as a teacher, you then get into, all right, well, what does life need? All life needs light energy. That's the, you know, so without that, there is no life. And then all life is involved with chemical energy and electrical energy. And so when they then start thinking about life and how life starts and all of that, you know, you get down into the cyanobacteria and things. And there's some wonderful, wonderful slides on, I don't know, on cyanobacteria that are just absolutely incredible. So it's just that's, I think, a good way. And the thing too, you know, you get a couple of teachers who work together, collaborate. And this is one unfortunate aspect of American education is there's very little time set aside for teacher collaboration. And that's really essential. And so then if you're, you know, you've got a group of other English teachers, let's say, or biology teachers, and, you know, that's this lockstep with the curriculum, then you're doing a unit, you know, you talk together about, okay, well, let's think about what would be a good prompt that every student can write about it. What is photosynthesis? You might have a couple of students write about it, but you want something that every student can write about. That's fundamental because they're drawing from their own, you know, conceptual understandings. And then something that's, you know, engaging, related to their lives. And so
Plus, you add a little bit of an element of competition when you have the voting part.
yeah,
The axis is different emotions and stuff, and
motivation.
yeah, and then we're ending with some sort of formal or official or more technical academic definition at the end of the sequence. Is that right?
You're building it.
Yeah.
You see, that's what the students are doing, is they're not taking the definition from bold letters in the back and memorizing it so they can pass the test. You're building it. It's that sort of reminds me of, almost 50 years ago, I guess it was, when I was teaching an 8th grade grammar class, that instead of, we didn't have a book, we just had notebooks, in spiral. And then we as a class developed our grammar. We started thinking back to early humans. What were some of those first words? And okay, there are objects and then actions, and and you then just start building it. And you then build this conceptual understanding of grammar, not based on definitions or prescriptions, but understanding how and why grammar developed, or the language developed that way. The language develops, grammar has a being. It exists apart from any definitions from any books. Humans learn to speak not by looking at a book, and so we just tend to look at it, prescriptively, descriptively, and not looking at it in terms of its origin and development. And that's in that origin and development that the essence of whatever you're looking at resides.
Very, very helpful. Very nice. Well, I do want to be respectful of your time, and I think.
Well,
I slowed you down at a few different points, so I apologize for that. But
no, I was going to say that no need for apologies, because this is what I love.
Okay, good.
I just have to throw in a little thing to honor my mother, who just had her 100th birthday.
Oh my gosh.
But for 50 years, she volunteered at an elementary school and went there and read with kindergartners and 1st grade students. And for her service, she was awarded this statewide award that goes to the person, non-educator, who has made the biggest contribution in the state of Colorado to education. She got it, and she got up and said, well, I guess I've been doing it for, this many years, and I love it. And I guess I'll do it until I drop. And it wasn't quite until she dropped, but she was going down and working with students when she was 97, 98 years old. So
amazing. Yeah.
You can see what a lucky person I am to have had a mother like that.
100%. And you're similarly generous, at least as far as what I could tell. You're with me 100%, and you like to share your ideas and your work publicly as well.
Yeah, well, this is what gives me great joy. I'd much rather do this than sit down and labor over an academic article.
Sounds good. Maybe we could do it again sometime.
Well, I think that's a must.
Okay, good, because they were just scratching the surface here, I think.
Yeah, I've got 30 years worth for you.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I'll take what I can get. So I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been
it's a pleasure. I've been checking out your work from a distance for a while now, and eventually I built up the nerve to reach out to you, and it was really nice so far. So let's keep it going, huh?
Yeah. Well, I thank you for the compliments, and I want to return them because as I said at the beginning, I am extremely impressed with the time and effort that you're putting into something that I think is extremely worthwhile, and you're doing it from the perspective of how can this be made useful for all teachers in the classroom. So thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll talk to you soon, and I appreciate it.
Yep.
All right,
All
Holbrook,
right.
take it easy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.